We can begin with the introduction. I suggest the committee introduce first Deputy Anna Gardiner, Chair of the Public Accounts Committee.
Deputy Christina Moore, Vice Chair.
Deputy David Wall, panel member.
Vijay Kakria, lay member.
Deputy Raluca Kovac, a member of the committee.
Philip Taylor, lay member.
Ali Awan, lay member.
Lynn Hammond, Controller and Auditor General.
Jabel, Treasurer.
Tom Walker, Chief Officer for Health and Care Jersey.
Jason Whitfield, Chief Information Officer.
And Andy Hagwell, Group Director of Strategic Finance.
And we schedule for the hearing for 1 hour and 45 minutes and have a number of questions to get through. Please could I ask you to keep your answers short and apologize in advance if we interrupt you to keep on time. Any questions that we'll not get around, we will follow up with the written questions. And the first area of questioning, it's audit follow-ups and financial controls, and I'll hand to Philip to start.
Thank you very much, Chair. My first question is to the Treasurer. Again, you produced a very thick document with a great deal of information in being the annual report and accounts. And certainly there have been many improvements since I first got involved in this exercise. However, I think you would agree that 1 year is only 1 year, and context is what really counts, and that's the context over a number of years and what is happening in our society. This last year, we've had another fiscal policy review panel report, which has talked about the increased and ongoing demand for health services, the fact that the stabilisation fund has now been depleted, and that the demographic changes will continue, and that maybe our reserves are not as sufficient as they should be in their view. So over the last 5 years, we've accumulated a group deficit of £576 million. And given your role as being responsible for managing the long-term financial stability of government finances, I'm wondering what your view and your comment is on that review, on that analysis, and also where that context is specifically referred to in this annual report.
Good afternoon. At first, I've not done a cumulative number of 5 years, although I do have my own view on the 5 years, and I'm not 100% clear whether that's before or after investment returns. I would say, in a piece of paper I walk around with, that there are challenges to the finances. They are brought to light in the Fiscal Policy Panel report. I'd firstly say that the scale of reserves for a small island jurisdiction, I would think, are still strong compared to other island jurisdictions. Having large reserves are important to island jurisdictions, particularly with concentration in a particular sector rather than a wider diversified sector. They're important for a number of reasons, not just access to debt should you need to do so, but from a financial resilience perspective. So over that period, those reserves have increased in value. They may be behind in respect of the strategic reserve, that which the Fiscal Policy Panel set a target of based upon work that they have done in the past relating to other places. But that does ignore to a degree a scale of a Social Security Reserve Fund, which was way beyond its original target, now is the order of 7+ years of expenditure within it, and does insulate as well from one of the cost areas for arising from the ageing population. It is one of three, I would say. The other is care, and we are in a good position in having the mechanism to fund that through the long-term care scheme, if not the scale of reserves that you would wish to see in the long-term care scheme. But I know that the current minister is wrestling with that, as have previous ministers. The one area relating to the ageing population that perhaps is of greatest concern and at the moment is topical is health. So those two other areas are catered for to a degree. Future healthcare costs are perhaps the biggest challenge at the moment from a health perspective. From a cost perspective, I would say that we are only in what I would call the gentle foothills of the ageing population pressures that health will be seeing at the moment, but you're already seeing that that is contributing to the health situation. I think, however, that it is right that it's a political choice as to where you have to direct your available resources, and that challenge is the challenge faced with the government and the State Assembly. So another way that I look at the last 5 years is that RPI has grown by 30% over those 5 years. Income has outstripped that by growing by 42%. Net revenue expenditure of towards balance over the period of that plan. But events sometimes happen. And they did during COVID. That took away some of our resilience, although we still got through that period with a better reserve position than when we started.
So what you're actually agreeing with, that this is a structural deficit, potentially, because of the challenges around health and demographic changes. And I know those are challenges that many jurisdictions face, big and small. So
there's a growing future potential structural deficit,
yes, and
rather than necessarily a current one.
So given this responsibility for the long-term financial sustainability of the finances, what are you doing about it? Because it's not just 1 year to the next, this is longer term, it's more than 1 year.
So first and foremost, don't duck away from that. I spend a lot of time doing that, but that ultimate responsibility rests with the Council of Ministers and the Assembly. Each successive Council of Ministers I've worked with has taken that into account, and their plans over that 4 to 5 year period show paths to balance. In recent times, the income line having increased through to 2024 is flattening. It's fair to say, and that is a challenge. We do, and we are looking forward within our business plan for the current year, and we've started that with a long-term capital plan. So we're now close to the solution with that in terms of bringing that forward alongside with some of those early foothills for funding within that document. So we have a long-term capital plan in place. Our next step is to have a long-term expenditure plan. Informed by that, in terms of that element that's around ageing population, colleague to my left and his team are bringing forward plans for the sustainable funding of health. So that firstly sets out what we think the cost base should be and where we see that rising into the future from an ageing population. Of course, it's not only increases, but in short, the answer is that we're working towards the plans that will give ministers and then the Assembly that longer term view.
So you see this as a political challenge as much as a government challenge?
Well, government is ministers.
Well,
in terms of public service, no,
as opposed to your responsibility.
I spend a lot of time thinking about it and putting forward proposals, and those pieces of work that I've talked about will set out a longer. If you think of a government plan as being a short to medium term plan, yes, we're talking medium to longer term. So in respect of healthcare funding, which is probably the biggest issue within the finances at the moment from the spend side, then we are developing plans, and it's fair to say actually my position is that if you start from the perspective that your tax base is not going to go up, I think some of the revenue pressures have taken priority as opposed to some of the capital infrastructure pressures that.
So given, as I said, this is a longer term structural, the solutions may well be political, but within the government administration, what steps are you taking or encouraging others to take within the organisation to address these challenges in terms of the delivery of services, for
So
example?
in terms of within the system, the piece of work that's been undertaken at Health
Yeah,
is a prime example of that. Your questions are going to wander on to, unless this is the question relating to what role does the corporate centre have on and in respect of financial discipline. I'm sure you'll come back to that question.
yes, we can come back to that, yes.
So, are we coming back to that question now or later?
We've got time to come back to it later, haven't we?
I think
Chair?
we'll get time for a comeback for health later.
Yeah, we have a whole section dedicated.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
with those, as you've described it, I don't see it referred to quite so explicitly in this report, given the fact this is 1 year within a longer-term context. Can you refer to me anywhere in here where actually that, what you've said is clearly set out?
I think I'd have to go through the pages, which there are many, as you just pointed out. Some of the key challenges that we talk about regularly are financial sustainability, and particularly from income and the threats relating to. There's opportunities as well, before I have many emails coming in, related to the costs of ageing population. And they're long recognised as long-term risks, opportunities, and becoming increasingly issues.
Okay, now while I'm thinking about your answers, others may have got some supplementary questions they'd like to ask.
On this one, I just want to ask how was highlighted the about 600 million group deficit over the 5 years. What time frame do you foresee for correcting this deficit trend?
Well, firstly, I've had a chance to think about what Mr. Taylor talks about during 5 years, but 5 years, I think it's worthwhile reminding ourselves, included years heavily impacted by COVID, when we spent way more than we would typically have spent in terms of supporting islanders. Again,
But figure
I don't get
aside,
credit for it, but we borrowed during that period, and then we drew down heavily upon consolidated fund and recovering income in repaying that borrowing. So that this is where I rather look at 2019 as a year compared to 2024, because whenever I'm running 5-year figures, if I go back from now, included a period of COVID.
But
So
that
the
was
reserves have dealt with that, and the income line has dealt with that to this point. The pressures are still there, and different pressures are now emerging in terms of geopolitical situation in particular. The reserves, the Social Security reserve, is in a stronger position now than it was at the start of that. So you will probably recall we had a 3 to 4 year period without putting money into the Social Security reserve fund. So
that's what I'm mostly interested.
Yeah.
Figure aside, how do you see, knowing the financial situation and the circumstances, in how many years you wouldn't think we'll have a deficit trend still going?
I'm not quite understanding the question.
So do you expect the deficit to continue, or in how many years we'll start having a surplus again, or balance?
So the
the
current
books?
plan, the current government plan, says deficits turn into surplus over the period of the plan. The plan that we will have to come through with in this budget will have to do likewise, because the statutory requirement is for the consolidated fund to be in a positive position. The only three ways that can be the case is if your income line grows or your income doesn't exceed your expenditure, your expenditure does not exceed your income, or that you transfer funds from elsewhere. So the current government plan plans for a return to balance and then surpluses. And I'd expect the future government plan would have to do so as well.
So how much flexibility is there within that? If we know a plan is only a plan, but as some boxer says, it's only a plan until someone hits you in the face. Now, we have got now a very different geopolitical situation.
Yep.
There's much more uncertainty, which could have implications for the tax revenues coming in as a result of the implications for that in the finance industry. So how much flexibility is there within the financial plan that you've got for the next few years?
We are currently preparing budget 25 for consideration by ministers. That has to be lodged by early September. It's fair to say the current financial position outside of the strategic reserve, which is in rude health outside of the security reserve, doesn't have a great deal in the way of contingency as it has in the past. The consolidated fund balance has been reduced. But the consolidated fund balance has been reduced over the period in recent years as a conscious decision to fund COVID by repaying any short-term debt rather than maintaining longer-term debt to pay for COVID. That was a choice. So when we also have the discussions with the FPP, I don't enjoy reminding them, but I do remind them, that the choice is arising from the COVID situation where to repay the debt that was accumulated during COVID or put money into reserves. Everyone agrees that repaying that debt was a better thing to have done than repay the reserves. So I would love to go back to a medium-term financial plan for 4 years. It has its own challenges, and actually it would have been significantly challenged during the COVID period and would be significantly challenged during the period that we now have of such volatility in markets, interest rates and inflation. I don't know. But in terms of planning horizon, favour it. It would. I haven't done a rehearsal of how much easier it would have been to work with. But the Assembly does have a 4-year planning cycle in accordance with legislation. That should set out a plan and has repeatedly done so over the periods. The issue that governments and the Assembly come across successive repeatedly and in higher volume recently relate to shocks to the care, be they banking crisis, pandemic, or now geopolitical.
Okay, I'm being rushed on, as you can see, because I'm overrunning my time. Now, we are looking to change the way the accounts are prepared by deconsolidating some of the wholly owned subsidiaries, which I understand why you're doing it. The concern then is, well, so how, if there are particular liabilities within those wholly owned subsidiaries which the central government, if you like, is responsible for through letters of comfort or guarantees or whatever, how will those be dealt? How will the public know what the financial position of those wholly owned subsidiaries are?
So, if it were the case,
I accept if it were the case, yes.
that borrowing were the subject of letters of comfort or, in particular, guarantees, I'm sure there'd be a discussion with the auditors on the first, then I would expect to disclose them in the accounts of the states because that's a future potential liability of the states of Jersey. So in those instances, they should feature in the notes to our accounts.
And of course, the value of those investments will still be reflected in the balance sheet.
Yep.
It's just the line-by-line elements of the profit and loss account will not be included in that. Will not include those items, but it would be because it's.
So they wouldn't do it line by line, but I'd expect debt that those companies have to affect the valuation that we would hold them in the accounts by.
Okay, thank
But
you.
also, would you expect an request to each law as still dependent on kind of your government agenda to have the annual report and accounts already done by the time the government has done theirs and compare and at least include the link of their annual accounts?
So we do have links. Sometimes we have our accounts out before they would have theirs out. I'm not aware of any extremely late reporting by them, and I'm talking now about wholly owned states-owned entities. I think the majority-owned ones have slightly different accounting years, so that would mean that they would have their accounts at different times. But certainly in the case where those entities currently are held in the way that we're proposing to hold them in the future, if they're Jersey Water and Jersey Electricity, for example, so no real change in the way that we're proposing to do that, but expect us to maintain links to those accounts, for those accounts to be publicly available, so that any reader of any interested party who wants them to understand the JEC or Jersey Water or Jersey Post or Jersey Telecom, read their accounts. I'd still propose that that's the best place to understand the activities of those entities, to read their accounts rather than to read it through the state's accounts.
But would it be possibility for all of them to still report at the same time, or at least the ones that, for any reason of their of the model of reporting, to still have links included where those would be when to have it all for transparency under one place, basically for easier access from the public?
So we can, very happy to. They should all be on the state's sites if they're currently not, or like individual websites of the entities if they're not. Beyond that, if the suggestion was that we put them on the Treasury website, then we would be happy to do so.
When
I'm
would
not
you,
saying that they will all land at the same time, and I'm not waiting for the slowest moving to publish ours.
when would you expect the accounts of those wholly owned subsidiaries to be published? Are they
Well, I could only
published
set them
now
out
for
to our
last year?
standards, so I'm looking for 4 months. I prefer for us to move back to 3 months. I think my preference is to get us back to 3 months. We did touch on 3 months for a couple of years. There is, however, has been a bit of a trade-off sometimes there between getting the quality as good as we'd like to deliver in the time. We have some parts of the accounts prep that move slowly, so getting the investments on level 3 investment.
And I was thinking of the accounts of these three entities, which will now be published separately and not consolidated. Are they available
they're
now
already now published
Which ones?
on the websites?
on there. So
Okay.
SOJDC.
They didn't publish. They should publish by the end of May. They promised 8th of June. It still hasn't been published on their websites. And this is what we are saying, that for the transparency, if the state's account published and they can publish within the time, like 3 months, that at least for transparency reason, public can see this is the state's owned entity, 100% owned. This is their accounts and this is state's accounts, and not they publish when.
So perhaps you could find out for us.
I'm now getting Andy looking at all the websites. See
No, we checked the website. We have checked website because it has been raised that already they should be published by the end of 4 months, and we are in different.
My stance is
Over by 5 minutes.
Yeah, okay,
my stance is generally if we can do it,
they can do it.
They can do
So
it.
I think this is what needs to be encouraged.
But I will-
I'm moving
I
to
will hold
some.
them to
I'm moving
different
quickly
things.
to
Go
different
on.
theme. Page 228, page 229. That for the reference of my next two questions. Why has there been an increase from 13 million in 2023 to 23 million in 2024 in relation to provision for bad debts? What's happened that we had this increase of 10 million?
That largely relates to taxation debts, general revenues debts.
But what's happened in 24 that it was a big jump?
I believe firstly, we ourselves identified that debt is rising, that companies and individuals perhaps are struggling to meet their tax debts. When I say tax, I'm saying social security debt, I'm saying personal
No,
tax
but I think
debt,
it's
sorry.
income tax here. If we're looking significant increase in income tax receivable, it's not really social security we're talking about.
I'm talking all of the balances where we've seen. So I'll give you one example. During COVID, it was possible for businesses to defer through formal schemes.
We're still 7.7 million in 24.
So that's an example, but also during COVID, we were within Treasury on a less formal footing, not going as hard after debt as we might have otherwise been, for hopefully understandable reasons relating to the stresses that those companies would see and individuals as well during that period. So we ourselves are seeing rising debt book. That rising debt book is not an uncommon phenomenon across other locations. We've looked at UK HMRC position as well. They've had similarly increases in the
But
debt
what I'm
position.
trying-
So I'll get to my answer.
Yeah, okay, because what happened between 23 and 24 that it was big increase? We didn't have COVID.
We did a lot more analysis in respect of the debt position.
So you found more debts that you were not aware before.
We had an extant audit recommendation, if I recall, that was to look again at our debt provision formula, if you like. I'm using formula the right word.
Okay.
We looked at it. We therefore took a more stratified position relating to more aged debts and made greater provisions against the aged debts than we had in previous years.
Okay. What are you doing with the recovery? Actually mentioned the COVID, and COVID we're talking about almost 5 years. As by the end of 24 we had 2.6 million in GST and 7.7 million in social security. In social security it's part of actually people being charged 6%, but it's never came into the treasury.
So firstly, it was still recorded as income
Okay.
in those years. We run on an accruals basis rather than on a cash basis. In terms of what we're doing about that, that has been publicised instead of what we're doing about that. We've written to all of those affected companies and invited them to talk, either pay or either discuss with the debt team a payment plan, and individuals of the team are authorised to agree a 1-year payment plan. If we find that those companies are in particular stress, the policy of the ministers allows us.
So, do you want me to pick this one up?
Yeah.
So there's a couple of bits, I think, which I would say. So one is obviously with our new financial system and the maturity of that system, we're starting to get better stratified information around the debt. So as well as so it's an improvement in the amount of management information we get, which means that we can look at the debt book in more granularity, which means that we then have to sort of review our how we do the calculations, but we can sort of apply a different percentages to different types of debt, if you will, in a slightly different way. What we've also done is obviously looked at all the information that we have around levels of collection. And as the Treasurer said, it's been a slightly interesting time because whilst COVID was going on, we maybe didn't push quite as hard on some of the debts to reflect the cost of living crisis. So now we are starting to do that. You start to see evidence of how collectible is that debt. It wasn't information that you had before because previously it was a different debt book. So it was hard to use the experience from previous years to apply the ECL. Now we're getting more information through. We can start to revise those calculations. So we've had several conversations with the auditors and we'll probably continue to do that as we move through into 2025 as well. So there may well be further refinement and changes as we get more information available to make that provision as, I was going to say accurate, as sort of appropriate as it can be.
Thank you very much. Moving on to the next question. In the operating balance, we've seen quite a significant variance of 16 million in the depreciation number from the budget. So the budget was around 54 million and the actual is around 73 million. Now that's a significant increase or variance from the budget. So we would like to understand what accumulates that variance.
Details that?
Do you, I can pick that up anyway. So just to clarify what's in that number as well. So in the budgeting process, we look at depreciation. What we don't do is include budgets for impairments because in general they are not expected. We're not expecting impairments. They're things that happen due to, for example, movements in valuations that we get from the professional valuers. We did have some impairments in the year, so those are one-offs. In the main, they were due to changes in the assumptions going into the valuation model rather than something to do with the underlying asset. So it's not that the building's fallen down, it's just that for example, if it's on a depreciated replacement cost basis, if the costs have moved, you might see changes, or if the value of land has moved, you might see changes in the values of the assets as well. So there is a part, I think it's, sorry, I don't have the numbers to hand, but I think it's about 10 million is one-off changes to those. There were also some write-offs of assets, so sort of writing down of assets that went through that weren't in the budget as well. So some of those related to, for example, at the Overdale site where there were assets on the book at a value. Obviously now they've been demolished, that asset would be removed.
Well,
Not-
these assets were not included in the original estimation, included in the budget
So if,
as estimated, because you knew that Overdale assets will go that year. So I wasn't surprised it would be under demolition.
I'll just pick you up there. That, it has been, at various points in the last few years, arguable that I could have anticipated that in the coming year. So,
But about Overdale, it started demolition, I think, kind of, it was on the way. Yeah.
but was it in September 23?
Yeah, but what we're trying to say, the Overdale, because you gave the example, if you wouldn't give example of Overdale, I wouldn't raise it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure we understood that was definitely the impairment position at September 23. Well, no,
It
so
was.
July 23.
But budget
that
was launched in September.
So-
What I'm trying to say that it's but if
And
we
those assets were
lose,
still being used, I think, in 2023.
so
So
again,
it's just
okay.
but to answer a different way, the depreciation number that goes into the budget is based on depreciation, as in the write down of those assets. It hasn't historically included things like writing off asset values for where we're doing disposals. It's not typically been a problem in previous years. I think this is a particular year where that has happened, which isn't a common thing. But it is something, you know, as we feed it into the process, we can review and make sure if there are things that are known in future budgets, we could look at that. I mean, these are all in effect non-cash movements. They're movements in asset values, not in money going out the door.
Just a minute. No, just yeah.
Sorry, I'm not quite sure. So what accounting standard are you using whereby you're disclosing impairments within depreciation? Because it's not FRS 102. I just had to go and double check.
No, that is true. But the operating balance is a part of the financial review, which isn't based on accounting standards. It's us explaining the finances for the year. The operating balance, we try and prepare it on as close a basis as the budget as we can, so that it's comparable and people understand how government performed against the plan that was set out. The budget isn't prepared on accounting standards, although we do try and keep things as close as we can in most instances. I mean, there's another option where you could just not include any of those impairments or write-downs in the operating balance at all, but still in the accounts you would see them as part of the bottom line deficit as we move through. So this is trying to keep things, it may not seem that way, but trying not to make them even more complicated than they are, if that makes sense.
Sort of, but not entirely to me. I suppose there is an element of choice in this, but I mean, was there a separate line disclosure in the P&L for the impairment?
Yes, impairments are separate to depreciation.
Okay, and was there a reconciliation in the P&L against budget as well?
So in the statement of political, is it a statement of political accountability? Make sure I get the name right. There is a reconciliation from the operating surplus, so the one that we report is consistent with budget, to the deficit that's reported in the accounts. We go through on a line-by-line basis.
Okay.
I'll find you a page number if you would like. It's,
Thank you.
You just follow. Yeah.
I'm on it now, page 142.
Okay.
I will check that. We may need to follow up in writing.
No problem.
Moving on to the next question. So previously there were quite a few IT controls which were identified by the auditors. Now, how large IT investments tracked against the business case objectives, and what are the delivery timetables around those?
do you want to start with the IT control?
Yeah.
So on the IT controls, we had a report in April for the areas that had made improvement and for further improvement from the auditors. We have actions, some for my department, digital services, and some for the owners, the business applications. We don't have a date or a deadline specifically for each one. That's being worked through at the moment.
And moving on to this year's audit, are there any audit findings that you want to take into account arising from these accounts? And were there any significant findings from the auditors? And what other internal controls improvement have been identified as required?
So there is a separate report in respect of IT controls this year. There's been
No, it's just like a
This year?
total.
Any findings needing action, basically.
Yes, there's findings requiring action, but they're improvements upon the issues that were raised previous years. So we're making progress against an overall plan. I'm looking at the report here. There's a number of systems with a number of processes. It's quite difficult to give a short answer to your question.
Maybe some timelines on addressing the main ones from those?
The main ones by the end of Q4.
Would it be fair to say that the auditors were able to place the usual level of reliance that they would have expected to on the internal controls for the 24 accounts and audit?
That was my understanding from the report back from Azars.
So are you talking about IT or more generally?
ITICs, yeah.
Successive auditors have taken the other approach, not taking reliance upon the IT controls in undertaking their audit. From previous year. We are getting ourselves into a better position, as Jason says.
And so you anticipate that by the end of this year, so I guess what you're saying is that the auditors would be in a position to place the usual level of reliance on them for the 26 accounts, but not the 25. Would that be
Yes,
fair to say?
That's the expectation.
Thank you.
But I guess it's worth saying it's for the auditors to decide how much reliance they can place on the controls and how that would affect their audit methodology based on the risk that they identify. So it's not for us to say.
You'd
as
hope
such.
they'd make an objective assessment.
Yeah.
But they would tell you what needs to happen for them to put reliance on it.
So we've got that in-depth report, more in-depth report this year, but it will still be their call as to whether they place reliance on that. So, for example, we are already part way through 2025, and I acknowledge your point about 2026. So part way through 2025, those matters will not have been resolved, therefore they wouldn't have been able to place controls on them, place reliance upon them throughout the whole period. Only towards auditors to my right.
So the question is, have you implemented the recommendations that they said you should, the changes you should make so that they can place reliance on it?
Yes.
Okay.
Until the end of 2024.
That's what Jason said, they're going to look,
Yeah,
they're
well-
trying to do that. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, we'll probably follow up with a question. We'll move to different part because,
Okay,
Yeah.
should I?
we'll go to the part and maybe we'll come back with follow-up questions. So we're moving now to remuneration and the surveillance and staffing and the REJ.
Okay, what I hope will be a quick section. The remuneration report shows there were 69 exit packages costing nearly £3 million in 24, excluding pension costs. And we would like you to explain, please, the rationale and criteria for approving each of those 69 exit packages and the associated redundancy costs, and what the process was for identifying those 69 positions, and whether that process was extended across all of government.
Okay. I think it will be difficult to describe for each of the 69 in turn.
No?
However, they fall into categories. So the middle of last year, a new voluntary redundancy scheme was put in place.
Okay.
Some of those individuals, some of our former colleagues will have exited through those voluntary redundancy packages of voluntary redundancy schemes. That scheme sets out payback and saving to be delivered by the department arising from the payment. And that's 2-year payback period, if I recall. We also have a compulsory redundancy scheme, and that'll be for areas of the business where a certain function has been determined to be reduced or ceased. And
What was the split roughly between the
so
two categories?
I'm coming with a different number than the number you've just cited to me. So I'm going 7 voluntary redundancies, 20 compulsory redundancies. Then we have a category relating to other settlements, and they will arise for a number of different reasons relating to perhaps the end of the relationship between the employer and the employee for whatever reason. There may also be conciliation agreements in the form of a JACS, Jersey Advisory and Conciliation Service Agreement. They will go through, it's fair to say, all of these packages will go through a number of layers of oversight from Chief People Officer's Department, Treasury from a value and money perspective, from legal advice and from the AO for each of those departments to confirm that they meet the criteria. From a VFM perspective, that will be largely addressing the issue of whether it will cost more in the longer run to take that particular end of a relationship through a different path.
So, of 69, we have 7 voluntary, 20 compulsory, and the balance were a mixed bag.
So assessment agreements, so generally we refer to as special payments, they're disclosed in that note. So they go through a different process because they're not in one of the schemes of either voluntary or compulsory redundancy.
How many of these represent a recurring saving?
So of the policies, the first of those that I've talked about, the 7 exits through the voluntary scheme with the order of just short of £800,000 recurring saving attached to those. I am aware, even though they're not being tracked in the same way, there are a couple of those, at least one I was very well aware of. One of those proposals was made before the new voluntary redundancy scheme, but along the similar sort of line. So it is a saving on top of that £800,000 per annum saving.
So I'm a little puzzled how a voluntary and therefore self-selecting scheme for leaving the employment of the government results in a recurring saving for the government. Does that mean that the jobs were completely redundant in the first place?
So the job becomes redundant as a result of a case having been put forward. So I've been involved heavily previous redundancy schemes in terms of voluntary. There will be many people who come forward to which the department is saying, I cannot do without that role or that individual, and therefore there will not be a saving, and therefore there will not be a redundancy.
Okay. And so has that process been applied across all of government to identify all potentially redundant roles?
I'd have to look back to see if it was extended to health, but I think it would be very clear that it's not intended for frontline roles where we're still looking to recruit to.
Yeah, I think at the time the policy excluded frontline roles.
Okay.
But there are instances as well where voluntary, it's not entirely self-selecting, as in you may have a group of individuals where a team is getting smaller. So there's an element of selection that people may put themselves forward. If there aren't enough, it may be that it moves to compulsory. But just in terms of the classification between the two, if you choose to completely scale down the team, that doesn't mean that some of those won't be voluntary rather than compulsory. As in voluntary is generally preferable to compulsory.
So I'm a bit confused. I mean, were business cases or rationales produced for each of these?
They will have been, yes.
Or all 7?
Yeah, because they would have had to go through the approval route.
Okay. And services won't be impacted through these reductions in these roles?
If an AO believed that the service would have been, or whoever was sitting in the AO shoes, then they would have had to address, in order for it to pass muster, as it were, what those service impacts would have been.
Okay. Thank you. Moving on, can you describe from the Treasury perspective the impact of the grade 11 plus hiring freeze on departmental operations and delivery timelines?
From a Treasury Department perspective, don't think that I would say that we've had a high level of impact where we've needed to seek exemptions from those recruitment freezes. We have favoured internal recruitment to those positions. We are observing, nevertheless, the freeze in a couple of places. We'll be bringing forward a restructure of the team further down the line.
So you say there's a preference. So what for internal appointments, what happens if the skills aren't present within the government?
So that would lead to a further approval process relating to whether we would be, whether on balance there should be an exemption against that role. There are parts of the business where serving that role is easier than it is in others. I have been, so far as I can, observing the freeze with some success and a number of internal opportunities having been created as a result.
Excellent. And can you give the public an idea of the number of these exemptions so far?
Off the top of my head, I would say that my exemptions today are principally within areas of greatest risk, or in the case of international tax team relating to the implementation of a Pillar 2 tax regime. So you've got a new system of tax arising. It needs a team to establish the implementation of that tax. It needs a team to bring that through the assembly and develop it. And it will need to be decided a team of colleagues to service that new line. But of course, all of that cost comes with increased income.
Okay, I understand. My next question, please. How are the costs of consultants and agency staff currently being monitored and benchmarked across departments?
So there will be a number of ways that will be done within departments. Many of those departments will have their own specific specialisms that they're looking for. So I don't hire many medical consultants in Treasury. Those will be pressures within health. The best place to monitor the rates of those services would be to, of course, to go back out to market. I know that that's what health are doing in respect of that, and we are either done or in the throes of doing that for local temp agency, for example.
So perhaps that's a question which I could address to you yourself, please.
Yeah,
For your
so
department.
sure. So agency costs within the health department, agency staff come to us through a master vendor arrangement. That hasn't been tested in the market for a number of years. So as the Treasurer said, one of the things that we're doing this year is to go back out to market and to test that against the market to see whether we're still competitive or not, and to see whether we can achieve better value for the taxpayer through doing that.
Okay, and when do you expect that process to be complete?
That process won't be completed until the end of the year. It's just started.
And given that it's a going to the market sort of process, is there some element of iteration or continuity in that, or would you expect that once you've completed it by the end of this year, there's going to be another break before you go back out to the market?
Usually a kind of one of these big agency staff master vendor type arrangements you'll probably only do every few years.
Okay.
So, I would see us achieving best value through the process within this economic cycle, and then in a few years' time it would be worth doing again because the economics would have moved, and that may be to our advantage.
I understand.
Yeah, I think,
Thank you.
Yeah, we can move to start it with the house small questions. Yeah.
So health and care Jersey saw the largest overspend in 2024, and as we heard from the treasurer as well, health is the biggest area of concern in this part. We note. So what level of reserves have been used to fund the overspends within health and care?
That's probably a question for me. Here was me thinking.
I know, you were just relaxing.
Yeah, I was trying to find my place where you were dealing with that question. So I caught the end of your question relating to...
What level of reserves have been used to fund the overspend?
In 2024,
Yes.
I think that's
Get
in
me
the
to the
annual
right
Or the
report and
health.
accounts, isn't it?
it is. So
Just trying to find my space.
So in short, what reserves were used, and do you see those reserves now at risk at all?
No, that's the number of the reserve.
Yeah.
Question.
So there were several allocations, which is why I haven't got the exact number right in my head, but it was around 28 million, I think, was the allocation to health. There were other allocations which weren't just for pressures; they were for specific items as well. So in the accounts, you'll see the difference from that. That
Okay,
was the
we'll ask
allocation in
questions further.
2024 from the reserve.
Yeah, might be more useful to ask it in writing to see the
Yeah.
exact
Yeah,
levels.
if
I'll
you'd
get
like
to
to,
the
we can
page
set
then.
up.
Yeah, we'll do it, yep.
No problem. And how did health respond to early overspend signs? Were actions timely and effective taken?
How did health respond?
Yes, to the early signs of overspending.
Let's say that you knew in the quarter one and after in quarter two, 24, that you are overspending. What has been done to mitigate overspend?
I think that is leading into the area for health territory.
I can have a go. So obviously, I can reflect back on what my predecessor did as accountable officer during that period. Obviously, I took over right at the end of 24, but I can see that the drive was to continue the financial recovery programme. So the FRP set out a number of actions for 23 and 24, and I can see that those were continued and the pressures worked upon. Some of those measures had a stronger effect than others. So you can see that in previous explanations of the drivers of the 28 million deficit, some of those FRP measures were more effective than others. So ones where there was slippage were things like locum doctor costs, where I can see that last year there was the FRP had a good success in reducing nursing agency costs, but was less successful in reducing medical staffing costs. And that's why this year that's become a focus in 25, because we didn't get the effect that we wanted from doctor agency costs in 24, and therefore needed to carry that into 25, and that contributed to the overspend.
So we note that the final spend for health and care in 2023 was 303 million. However, the budget for 2024 was set at 286 million. Why was the budget set assuming the cash spend of the department would be lower?
I'll deal with that. So between 2023 and 2024, firstly, it was the first year of the original estimate for the financial recovery programme at £12 million. So that obviously comes off the number for 2023, reduces the number for 2024. Having put more money in to bring the health budget up to its spend, you then had the savings plan that reduced from that sum. Added to which there was already a saving of 3 million, so there's 15 million. There were also a number of one-off costs that were in 2023 or funded in 2023 that were removed in 2024. So that included funding for a rheumatology review. That included, hopefully you're on the right page, Andy. That also included, now mine's gone blank.
Do you want me to fill in? So there's rheumatology. There was one-off funding for reduction of waiting lists in 2023, which wasn't recurring into 2024. There was also some funding for the turnaround team in 2023 specifically that then fell away in the 2024 budget, and also some previous funding was allocated under the Jersey Care model, which ran out at the end of 2023 in line with the government plan. So those are some of the adjustments.
So adjustments for, in shorthand, one-off funding that expired in 2024 and savings targets arising from the financial recovery programme.
Because that's what we've seen as well on the Hansard from the public hearing last July from the counterpart. The expectation was that the 24 million that was asked for will continue to provide what we're providing now, no more, but what we're providing now was said. and even continuing on the next 3 years with the 25 million savings. And seeing this level of overspending then in 2024, when was this first identified and was this flagged to the Assembly in time?
Wasn't flagged to the Assembly, so it would have been flagged in terms of reports that go to the Council of Ministers, which I believe scrutiny then have access to in respect of the forecast for the overspend position. I would say that we regularly have, particularly early in the year, forecasts of overspend by the end of the year, and departments then commit to address those overspends during the year. But those reports do go to the Council of Ministers, and then, as I understand it, those papers are accessible by scrutiny.
Question, when you know that you're expecting overspend in particular departments or 2 departments and it's going to the Council of Ministers, what advice would you give as a treasurer to the Council of Ministers in the middle of the year saying we are overspending and to keep within the budget we need to introduce mitigation measures, and not necessarily it would be maybe in one department, it might be to introduce across the government to ensure that we are finishing the year within the budget and not just transferring from the reserve to cover the overspend. Because everyone, I think, used to that doesn't matter how much we'll spend, we'll receive by the end of the year whatever we overspent from the strategic reserve. And this is kind of the
Well,
process.
not from the strategic reserve.
From whatever reserve,
That's not
from
within-
different reserves.
So that's not within the gift of the Treasury Minister to transfer funds during the year from the strategic reserve.
It will be
What
signed
it-
by the minister, but at the end of the day, the deficit would get covered by the end of the year.
So firstly, in previous years, we would be looking at forecasts of other departments to see whether forecasts from other departments for underspends were sufficient to cover that. Next, you'd be looking at whether the level of contingency reserve is sufficient to cover that. I should say, first step is back to department. Please, your responsibilities are to live within the budget that is set for you by the Assembly. There will be reasons why departments need other funding related to unforeseen events or new things that come through, and those will be the subject of a business case. So firstly, we're looking at, can it be addressed by the department? Secondly, can it be addressed from underspends in other departments? Thirdly, does it need reserve transfers? And by reserve transfers, I mean contingency funding, what we used to call the general reserve. Mm-hmm. Thereafter, you might look to see whether capital underspends that are being forecast could be used temporarily to address that situation. So first and foremost, it's to make sure that we're delivering upon the commitments in respect of savings and understanding the drivers for the higher level of spend.
Deputy
Yeah,
Wong has a
just
follow-up.
one question. All of this just sounds quite reactive. You're reacting to the scenario that's put out there in front of you. Do you have any, I don't know if you have any leverage as a Treasury Department to sort of think about, how can I say, the interaction between the different areas, whether it be infrastructure, whether it be health, but how, in other words, can we do a prevention? In other words, what actions need to be taken to prevent overspending? So is there any linkage done? Is there any research done within Treasury which says, well, if we don't spend in this area, or we spend more in this area, this will save a lot more money, we'll get more bang for our buck in that area. Is there any cross linkages in those areas? Is that any part of Treasury's remit, or is that down to individual ministers to deal with that, to sort that out? Or do you make recommendations in those areas?
First and foremost, for departments. Secondly, I would say that, for example, in shared services, of which I am one, you might look for savings that could contribute that, but usually those are in centralised budgets in any case. I think the last savings plan to the Assembly did focus more towards the back office, i.e. delivering savings from the back office to be redeployed into frontline services. So there are those. We have overarching functions in that respect. We also have the opportunities to join up now, even more so than we always had the opportunities, but more so now between digital services, people services and trade.
I get those visions, but I'm just thinking about more, for instance, let's just give a scenario. If we spend more in keeping people active, in other words, we put more money into sport, for instance, we've got a big debate going on tomorrow about sport and the amount of money not being spent in sport. Is there any recognition that if we make more investment in those kind of areas and keeping people fitter for longer and all the rest of it, that will actually mitigate our health spend? So is any of that thinking done within Treasury?
So that thinking is done usually by the people who bring those things forward and are often the experts in those particular fields, be they in preventative health measures, be they in exercise referral. They talk about savings that should come from the research that they've undertaken in other parts of the service.
But there's no measure. There's no measure done. There's no measuring.
There will be measures within there, but converting those actually into savings you would grab and remove from budgets elsewhere is very difficult to do when you're taking UK research, and some of that will be theoretical. Some of that will be based, well, not necessarily theoretical, but it'd be difficult to extrapolate across our own population. This has been done a number of times in respect of health, Jersey Care model and other such strategies where you look at, in actual fact, you have to probably accept healthcare will go up. What you're trying to do is ensure as much as you possibly can that increase is minimised, but it would still go up, and it'll be hard.
Just to my point about where we invest in other areas. But, okay.
So just very quick before moving to the next question. So would you say that forecasting models been improved, and how accurate have recent forecasts been in practice then?
So I think, firstly, across much better informed view of where those pressures going forward are, and what you might do to mitigate some of those, and some of those further down the line in terms of healthcare strategy, in particular impacts of ageing population, will give us more information. I would say, however, that there's always going to be a variation. In an island the size of ours, you quickly can end up spending, and I'm sure Tom can give examples, £100,000, £500,000 more on treatments to a small group of people.
We'll articulate probably more in writing on this area.
Can I just an interesting stat though? I mean, by the time you get to the middle of the year, I think our forecast overall between departments, not individual departments, was close to about 99% of the outturn. So the forecasting isn't on an overall basis is actually reasonably close to where we ended up.
Individual departments set a budget, then goes to the states for overall approval. What happens to the accounting officer for that if he actually overspends his budget? What is the consequence of it? Just ask you for some more money, transfer from somewhere else. What actually happens?
So, I would suggest a view that if that AO had not been doing their job and turned up on the 24th of December,
Was their budget?
out of surprise, surprise, I know I said it was in budget, and I'm now £20 million overspent. I might expect quite dramatic consequences for that area, but it's not.
Part of his role, of the person's role, is to manage within the budget.
Yes.
If they don't do that, they haven't done their job.
So part of that role also is to deal with the pressures that they see from the customers or the patient base that they see. We need a wider discussion about, and amongst ministers, as to whether that overspending should be brought into control by the AO, or whether further funding should be given. That would inevitably usually lead into two things. One, perhaps a business case, but certainly increased monitoring of plans to return back to budget. I would say generally the expectation is that AOs stay within their budget, the responsibility sticks with them.
Have there ever been any instances where has been a consequence for an accounting officer for an accounting officer overspending his budget?
My understanding is yes.
So it has happened.
My understanding, which Maybe not necessarily having been from reading the file, but there have been. And
In your
and I'm
time.
not saying recent.
So I'm just hearing, I'm just going to sense it's a fudge. You just
it
find
will
money
be
elsewhere to
replicated.
cover the deficit. Sorry,
So
Yeah, I think that what the point
Sorry.
you raised, and maybe something that we do need to reflect, and you mentioned the ministers, so conversation with the public. If in the middle of the year you see substantial overspend and decision needs to be made by the accountable officer to breach public finance manual and overspend, or accountable officer, would he need to take an actions and to come to the minister, and minister needs to come to the assembly and decide what action steps can be taken. It might be not popular steps to ensure that we are not overspending within the year. But how we manage this
a
conversation?
minister may choose to do that. I don't think a minister has done that. And I don't think a committee prior to that has done that outside of exceptional emergency positions. It's firstly and foremost for the council of ministers to be managing that within the budgets department. Firstly, it's department. Secondly, it's overall government, i.e. council of ministers, to be managing that within, and the agent to be able to do that, and the responsibilities there rest with myself and with the Treasury Minister. If you get to the point where there are no options open to the Treasury Minister and you are going to overspend, so state's expenditure in total is overspent, then there would be a requirement for the Treasury Minister to come forward with that to the Assembly.
But we did overspend. I mean, we
So
overspent more than...
an individual department in accordance with, and this is about legislation, not just the manual. These are statutory responsibilities, but those statutory responsibilities can say that the Treasury Minister can transfer funds from other budgets in consultation with ministers, be they capital or be they revenue. They should be the first measures to be taken in making sure that a necessary adjustment to budget is made.
But the moment that budget approved by the states and individual department overspend, the responsibility is on accountable officer for this department. So the accountable officer allowed overspend within the department.
Yes.
So it is full responsibility. What we're trying to establish, how you ensure that accountable officer don't overspend, or they're taking actions that it's clearly in public, like letter of instructions, because we are accountable officer is not agreeing to spend the money because we are overspending.
This particular area, so my own view is that letter of instruction doesn't cut it, because overspending against an approval is a statutory responsibility.
Yes.
So in areas where you may disagree with a minister, you can be instructed to do something, having set out your challenges with having done so. But the Treasury Minister does have the authorities to put more money into that budget. That is as a result of statute.
I mean, perhaps I can.
Just a minute, my deputy mayor would like to.
It's okay. I can't remember your current title, sorry, but I'll let the accountable officer speak.
I was just going to give a live example of the tensions that you deal with as an accountable officer in this circumstance. So, you know, one of the cost pressures that the health department has had over a number of years is individual packages of care. So as you know, the long-term care fund deals with levels 1 to 4, and above level 4, if you have severe need, then that comes from the health budget. So 1 to 4 is within a ring-fenced long-term care fund. Above that comes from a capped budget, a fixed budget, which is the consolidated fund. Now, you know, over the last 4 years, those costs have risen 80%. So that budget in 2021 was an expenditure of 9.3 million. In 2024, that was 16.9. Now, there's no agreed policy cap on that. When the long-term care fund was brought in, the proposition in 2013 said, well, that will only ever be a small number of cases, you know, maybe 20 a year. It's now 200. Now, you know, when I write to Richard and explain that, he and I know that I could absolutely bring that expenditure back down to its 2021 limit. So I could take £17 million of expenditure and make it 9 million again, you know, through a series of quite severe interventions, and that would fulfil my duty as the accountable officer. But, you know, I'm not sure that either States Assembly or Council of Ministers would thank me for doing that.
Or the public.
Or the public. And so there has to be a dialogue around, you know, is Richard holding me to account for, you know, reducing areas of inefficiency? Yes. Can this be solved through efficiency gains? No.
No.
And so this is where it becomes a dialogue between the Treasury and the department.
I think it's
and
a
I
really
just
good
wanted to give
example.
it you as an example.
Yeah.
It's an
Yeah.
interesting example, but it identifies, though, that officers, accountable officers and ministers need to together approach this issue and in a short, medium and long-term strategic fashion. We know that every business, every household is facing rising costs. We know also that Jersey faces a demographic challenge that's well documented. And so how is that strategic view coming together to enable each department to deal with those costs and in fact focus in on the productivity measures that need to be delivered. And the question here is, what productivity targets do you have for HCJ now to assist yourselves in coping with this situation, rather than just shuffling around some money at the end of the year to make it good?
Yeah. Do you want to do the first question or the second? Shall I do the second on productivity?
Yes, I think I would refer to the pieces of work that I talked about earlier in respect of healthcare funding in particular. That is the sustainable healthcare funding work that has been undertaken that will come forward.
But that's a piece of work
outlined.
aimed at raising more money through charges, essentially.
Well, the first thing
it's
it's doing
not-
is saying how much money is needed. They now lead on to the productivity.
No,
answer, and then
I'm
that's-
afraid it's not taking a holistic view, and it's not focusing on the productivity improvements that can be made to deliver services in a better way that delivers better outcomes. We all sat around the table here before this hearing, and practically everybody could come up with an example of an opportunity gain to be made in healthcare that would improve service and reduce cost. Nearly everyone.
And that's just
If
from
you walk-
personal
Sorry,
experience.
I just
If you
thought-
walk down
I thought the
King
two-
Street and listen to the public and their experiences about
I
as
thought the
patients,
two questions were separate.
Okay.
You're saying that one, in which case Tom is now going to turn to productivity.
I can do that.
Yeah.
I can
Yeah.
do that. So it's absolutely the case that, you know, just about every health organisation you look at, there are opportunities to improve efficiency and productivity. That's well documented. Usually, that's in the kind of 2 to 3% per annum. Is what's achievable in a good healthcare organisation. So, you know, the top NHS trust in the UK, Guy's and St Thomas's, their aim is to get 3.7% during this year. So, you know, and they're the top trust in the UK. But generally speaking, get between 2 and 3%. So that's absolutely the case. What do we focus on at the moment in that? Well, we're looking at, you know, we look at areas where we can improve, you know, what we're getting out for what we're putting in simple terms. So things like operating theatre utilisation are a good lead indicator of how efficient we're being. That's why we publish that in the annual reports and accounts, because actually that's a productivity measure. Is that improving? Yes, it is. So that was down in the kind of the 60 to 70%. That's now up to 76%. You know, national NHS target is to get theatre utilisation up to 85%. They've never achieved that, but they have got it up to 79%. So we know that, another healthcare organisation can get up to 79%. So we still have opportunity between 76 and 79%. And we know the things that we can do to improve that, and the team work on that, because the cost of running an operating theatre during the day is fixed, and if you're not maximising, the kind of patient benefit throughput of that, if you're losing half an hour at the start of the day, if you're losing time throughout the day, then you focus on that. One of the other things that we focus on quite hard are our kind of do not attend rates. Do not attend rates are incredibly important in healthcare because, an outpatient clinic is a fixed resource. You've bought the time, you've bought the resource, and then if you get, underutilisation, then, you're being less productive than you could have been. There's people in Jersey that could have been seen. So that was up at kind of 11, 12%. We're now down to about 9.5%. Our aim is to get down to 8%. Those numbers sound quite small in percentages, make a huge difference throughout the year, in more people being seen. So we really focus on that. That's, one of my big focus, as the chief officer, to make sure that we're utilising the resources that we're being given, as efficiently as we can.
Now that the person who has been leading the financial recovery programme is leaving the organisation, how will this process continue in identifying and driving through productivity improvements in the organisation?
Yeah, and I think that, having, somebody with expertise leading the early stages of the financial recovery programme was incredibly helpful. Actually, I can see that coming in, that was helpful. But actually, this now needs to transition into a continuous cost improvement programme. So a lot of top healthcare providers, they just run a continuous cost improvement programme. And it suits healthcare because healthcare runs on continuous improvement. That's the ethos and the philosophy. So it will transition from being a one-off financial recovery programme into a enduring cost improvement programme. And then that will be led really by me and the other directors, because, this shouldn't be all vested in a single finance lead. This is actually something that we as the leaders need to lead as a ongoing continuous improvement, so that we're achieving, at least 2%, if not 3% per annum in terms of cost improvement.
Thank you. Without a health strategy at present, how are you able to make decisions and discharge your financial responsibilities and maintain internal control?
I mean, the Island Health and Care Strategy will be incredibly helpful when that's developed through, potentially a partnership board if the Assembly's minded to improve that, because that really gets to where the main efficiency wins are, which is in the system. It's in the interplay between primary care, community care, hospital care. We know that those interfaces is where there's big opportunity going forward to actually improve the system as a whole. So at the moment, we're focusing on the bit of the system that we're responsible for budget-wise, and we're responsible for acute, and we'll soon be responsible for ambulance, and we're responsible for community. Right now, we're not responsible for primary, but once we've got a partnership arrangement in place, then we can start to really focus on whole system efficiency. So the strategy will be, I think, incredibly helpful when it comes forward, because that means then all parts of the health system will be able to agree what we're going to focus on. So rather than just us focusing, say on, improving the performance on early detection of cancer, actually the whole system will. primary care colleagues funded through the HIF will be with us on that, and we'll have a proper partnership arrangement. So I think it's a good question. It will be very helpful, but for the moment we're focusing on the resources that we have responsibility for.
Okay, thank you.
I think
Do you want to go back to?
Yeah, no, because we interlinked a bit with that. So I just wanted to ask, what is the turnaround team's mandate in progress, you would say?
So the mandate of the turnaround team was set in 2023. There was a 2023 mandate. There was a FRP program published that reflected that mandate. So, that was as published and as set in 2023, and it's all the usual things that you'd expect it to do around, stabilising. And then moving on to over time improving over a 3-year cycle. So the FRP was a 23, 24, 25 cycle, with 3 different distinct stages. We've moved through the first couple of those stages, and now we're on to the final stage. And the final stage is improving, and it's what we talked about. It's embedding that idea of continuous cost improvement into the system.
okay. Thank you. And one more question from Deputy Moore before we're moving to the next.
Got two actually
Okay,
that
yeah.
I think are equally important. Firstly, what are the 3 most important lessons learned from 2024 spending trends that will influence 2025 decisions?
I think there are 2 or 3. So it's clear that as we've gone through 23 to 24 to 25, some things have been dealt with in the earlier stages of the programme, and I can see that as the accountable officer coming in. So you can see that things like vacancy control, control over establishment, the control mechanisms have been put in place and are working. And I think that, now for me, the things that really we need to learn from the early stages and pull forward are the things where, there aren't necessarily a full set of controls and caps in place. I mean, we talked about individual packages of care. That's non-means tested, non-capped, open-ended expenditure. That hasn't been. There hasn't been an opportunity to deal with that in the earlier stages. So for me, dealing with areas that don't have a cap or a natural control mechanism that enables me to fulfil my duty as an accountable officer, are one of the big things I take from the earlier stages into these latter stages. And there's 2 or 3 of those. There's tertiary care referrals. There's individual packages of care for people in Jersey. And then also, there's some of the medicines costs as well, high cost treatments that, again, they don't really have a cap mechanism to them. So I think for me, those are the big ones to take forward into this year. Some of those decisions, as we talked about, they aren't really just for me as the accountable officer to decide. That has to be something that the democratic system, engages in, and ministers and COM and others think about, whether they want to put controls on that expenditure. And then, of course, if that's going to become an expenditure without a natural control mechanism, how do we deal with that? So you can see that that's dealt with differently. High care costs, are dealt with in the UK through local authority capping mechanisms. It's possible to do. It would be contentious. People would get suboptimal care, but it is possible, and those choices need to come forward. And the same with some of the other areas. So, the UK, has a cancer drugs fund. It has that because leaving those decisions locally to clinicians really is a little bit suboptimal. It's very hard for a clinician not to approve a 250k treatment for a single person in front of them, even though it might only extend their life by 6 months. Whereas, in the UK, they take those decisions into a dedicated kind of high-cost cancer and treatment fund set of decisions. Again, we need to think about whether we want that or whether we want to keep it within the consolidated fund. If we keep it funded by the consolidated fund, then we have to reconcile the fact that I'm capped. You know, I have
Thank
no
you.
authority
Yeah,
No, thank
that's
you.
very
to be
clear.
flexible.
So a final point, if I may, the annual report and accounts identifies that clinical governance assurance work following the clinical governance report of August 2022 has come to an end. In light of that, what focus do you now have on clinical quality as Chief Officer? And can you advise the Public Accounts Committee on how much poor practice is costing the health service and what you are doing about it?
I don't have a cost, but I can talk about what I'm doing on clinical quality and care. So, I mean, the risk on clinical, the risk on assurance of clinical quality, because that was the problem. It wasn't that the quality itself was necessarily not where it needed to be. It was the assurance mechanism wasn't where it should be. That risk has reduced because now there's been a series of measures put in place around that. So now, you know, we have proper mechanisms in place to deal with never events, to deal with serious incidents, to deal with learning from that. So actually I've been reassured coming into health. A lot of the usual mechanisms that you'd have in place to gain assurance are now there. So actually I feel more assured about that coming in. Does that mean that nothing will ever go wrong? Of course not. This is healthcare. Of course, you know, things will still happen, but have we now got mechanisms to, you know, monitor incidents, to ensure that, you know, we're adopting best practice? Yes, we have. So I think that, you know, it's, to use the cliche, it's a journey, you know, and of course, you know, it's getting better, but the basics are there. And then I think the next phase will then be transitioning those mechanisms into inspection by the Jersey Care Commission, because the Jersey Care Commission will then become the standing mechanism that stands over health and care to check that we're meeting the standards and that we've got mechanisms in place. So now, you know, the focus is very much on how we improve what we've got to prepare for Jersey Care Commission oversight. And then once the Jersey Care Commission start to oversee us, we'll then be in a cycle of continuous improvement.
Thank you. We'll move to a couple more questions. And,
One
yeah.
quick one, which touches on the clinical quality. How would you make sure that all departments within the health, for example, are communicating properly? For example, A&E with the GPs, with the specialists, to not duplicate work and do the operations for each patient in the right order?
Yeah, so there are definitely disconnects in the wider system. So the connections between acute care, tertiary care in the UK, primary care, you know, they exist and they work okay, but they're not where they need to be. And this is one of the debates that ministers in the Assembly will need to have, because to make care work better in a seamless way for patients means that we do need to move to a single patient record, not to multiple patient records. For Jersey, that would be absolutely transformative. You know, that would be moving to a single patient record would be a change that would last for future generations. When we're not all doing this, people would still be benefiting. But, you know, the financial case for making that investment has to be balanced against all the other cases of things that we need to invest in and affordability.
Has this been looked at all as estimates of what it would look like?
So I think that you've heard the health minister say in lots of forums that yes, he's looking at that and looking at what that cost would be. But as I said, that has to be balanced. So undoubtedly it would improve things, but is that the best use of resources for us as a jurisdiction? Yeah. That's a decision that, you know, really has to be made separately.
How much would the investment be?
I haven't got the figures in front of me,
Let's have
but
some
it would be a
ballpark in
multi-million pound,
Oh, sorry?
multi-million pound investment.
Well, that could be 5 million, it could be 100 million. So where, you're saying we'd have such a great benefit. There must be some handle on what the investment would need to be.
But let's not go on this one because we have one
Okay,
more supplementary and we move for 5 minutes to 2 more themes. Yeah.
Great. One more question, harking back to your reply to lessons learned from the budgeting process. You mentioned that, well, I think what you said was that there is no system in Jersey for comparing the price of a treatment, not necessarily long-term care, but a treatment against the improvement in quality of life and life years and things like that, like in the UK. So I think my question is, at what level are treatment decisions actually made in that case?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. So at the moment, we're relying mainly on NICE. So, you know, the UK government has invested public funds in NICE. NICE work out, you know, kind of quality life years. So they negotiate with drug companies about whether, you know, a treatment is value for money. You know, they've made that investment.
Okay.
What we then have to do is we then contextualise that into Jersey. And so we have, at the moment, going through the system, a draft prioritisation policy that will help us translate NICE into what's appropriate for Jersey. And sometimes in Jersey, you find that you do need to modify NICE. So we have various clinical panels that already exist. And what they do is adapt NICE. So NICE is essentially the default position. That's what our hospital policies say. In the absence of anything else, we work to NICE because it's got all of that built into it already when we get it.
So
And then what we do
how
is
long has that
adapt
been
it.
the case?
NICE became the default standard, I think, in 2023. And then the policy's been developed through 24. And now I'm refining the policy further in 25 so that we have
So our
more...
standards will be lower than NICE?
They will be adapted from NICE. I think one of the challenges that we have with NICE is that NICE is designed for a UK health system. So that's the mental framing that they design it through. And often in Jersey, you need to adapt it so that it works in our context, because our context isn't the UK one.
Different debate, yeah. We'll go to NICE. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we move into government plan revisions and capital programme. So this capital and other project expenditure was sort of £64 million below the approved budgets in 2024. I think probably my first question really is what is the impact on our economy of that level of underspend? Of those levels of underspend, would you say?
So that'll be across a number of categories of spend. So obviously the impacts will be different if they're digital, or if they are paying for professional services at this point in time, or if they are importing raw materials or using on-island raw materials. I don't have the figures in front of me.
No,
but
I'm just thinking is if government doesn't get that money pushed out into the economy, isn't there that has a consequence?
To the extent that they're using on-island resources, then yes, they will. Of course, FPP suggestion at the moment is that perhaps government is, by running deficits, by putting more money into the economy than withdrawing it from taxation and other means, could well be adding to inflationary pressures, but they are different within each of the sectors. So if these are construction projects, and if construction has a gap in it at the moment and those projects are not coming forward as quickly, that might happen.
Okay, so
But that impact is considerably less than it would have been in the past. The past sat on much bigger numbers. The majority of this spend, this underspend, is one project, and that's health facilities.
That's the point I'm going to make out the 62. Did you say 64?
I got 64 down here, but
So wait, 60,
Okay.
45 million of that was to do with the hospital project
Yes,
itself,
yeah,
which is
yes,
obviously
yeah.
slightly different from the rest of the programme.
Okay.
I think just the other point I would make is that that number compares against the approved budget. So that does include carried forward amounts where projects didn't spend in 2023. So I think the actual difference between what the government plan said to the expectation of industry and what spend was is probably slightly smaller than that number that you've
thank you.
described.
I've got one specific question here, which is why was the Liscay Youth Centre budgeted for in the 2024 budget, but not taken forward under the capital programme?
So that largely rises through decisions that ultimately get made through the Council of Ministers and then the Assembly. There are a number of reasons as to why any particular capital project will be advanced or funding adjusted. My understanding in the case of the Liscay Youth Centre was that it wasn't as advanced as it might have previously been laid out, and that therefore the department would not have spent the money as quickly as that. At the same time, there were another project in particular, but other projects that were closer to being delivered, and therefore they were reprioritised during the process to be delivered. This case still is in the plan, but there's and we are looking to see if we can advance feasibility.
So
work
is
on that
there a
particular
lost
project.
cost to switching programs like that? In other words, does it cost money when you change tracks? What is
Yeah,
the cost? I would say opportunity cost.
I think at the early stages of a project, most likely not. I think the opportunity cost is almost the other way around. If you have expenditure tied up in projects that you don't deliver, the opportunity cost is not delivering those other projects and not, reference back to your last question, then putting that stimulus, stimulation into the local economy.
It would be also good to Steve will follow up with the question what was delivered instead. We'll go to our last question for today, which you will have.
It's a hot day and I know you want to get to Aqua Splash as quickly as possible.
Right.
But I do notice that the cost of the Aqua Splash facility is rising. And its projects are managed through a contract with Serco. I'm interested to know how that contract is managed. Who is responsible for managing it?
So that is a question best directed at the infrastructure.
But you're the treasurer.
I am the treasurer. There are only 24 hours in a day. These budgets are, and these contracts are managed within the departments best placed to do so. We were originally working through the answer to that. My understanding was that question had come off the question list.
But the deficit was over £1 million this year.
We are in a position with that contract whereby it's my understanding that the state picks up a balance if and where there are losses to that particular project.
Is the contract with the commercial services that under your responsibility?
No, this is my understanding. This is departmental, something corporate contract, and we're in the infrastructure.
So you're saying that these are better questions directed to the accounting officer of the infrastructure department?
They are. I apologise for not having done the work and giving you the answer here and now. But my understanding was that question had come off the question list, so we prioritise the other areas.
So if we write to you, you will then come back
Yes,
having consulted it with the infrastructure.
I will give you the answer if you
Thank
like.
you very much.
Thank you. And I think one of the points around the Aqua Splash and all other things, it's about, and again, I'll not go into the details because we saw top-up grants across various organizations, some of them with infrastructure, some of them with the economy, if it's Jersey Sport, Jersey Business. The question is, and this is why we are looking at you as a treasurer, how you ensure sustainability of the finance position on the long terms to the arm's length organizations that received grants or would receive extra subsidy, as there are several requests for top-up during the year across different departments. How you ensure that this request will stop it actually and will go back to what was agreed at the first place.
Well, so thankfully, and I'm relieved to see that some of the reporting of those top-up grants is separate and makes it clear that those were top-up
Yes,
grants.
I welcome
rather
it, by the
than-
way, and I think public too, for the
rather
transparency.
rather than growth in the base, because then sometimes what comes back is you've now cut the funding to that particular grant-aided body, rather than it being clearer that that was a top-up grant. That top-up grant might be for a specific initiative, and I know that's the case in a couple, or it might be because of some of the costs that they are facing. I know that's the case in respect of a couple that the Social Security Minister did. It's made clear in any discussions we may have when we have those discussions with them that need to be careful not to do so in such a way that creates a future commitment outside of the budget process.
If any request for top-up grants or top-up subsidies scrutinised by the Treasury?
So I have finance professionals that service those departments, I'd expect those to be passing their desk when the department is considering.
I think that we'll write more questions on that one
I
because
have
I'm
had
minded about the
discussions
time.
in respect of some of them, I've not had discussions in respect of all of them, back to original comments. Areas have their responsibility of their budget. If they're living within their budget and their minister wants to do particular things, then they are free to do
Within
it.
the, if there are no overspend in the department budget.
And
Yeah.
on this one, can you just give us then an example of a cost that raised concern within the arm's length bodies?
Sorry.
A cost that raised concern, an example.
So the Social Security Minister talked to us about support to certain grant-aided bodies that come within their domain. I don't want to pick on any one particular one of them. And that was around, actually, was a responsible action to take. She knew that she had underspends in her benefits budget when benefits are treated differently to discretionary spend. And I think some of the discussion you're having with Tom reveals that he rests between the two. So benefits are what you'd call annual, the right way around, annually managed expenditure. So annually managed expenditure. So they can vary out with the control of the department, and that is particularly is income support benefit and is in particular is also student finance. That minister had that AO had an underspend on that particular area. She knew she had that underspend, but she knew that generally it's not the right thing to then go and spend that on something else on an ongoing basis, because you need to take policy decisions separate to what the economic position and forecast for that budget is. They came to talk to us about one-off use of that for those purposes.
Okay. Any more quick questions from the committee? Checking? No. Thank you very much for your time and thank you for your answers. And we'll follow up with the written questions shortly, probably next week. And public hearing is closed.